Next on At Your Service, our topic today is on anxiety. Stay tuned, you do not want to miss it.
Welcome. Today on At Your Service, we will be discussing anxiety, and we have two special guests, two school psychologists that work with your children. So, welcome. Welcome, Dr. Bernholz and Dr. Isava. Thank you very much. And can you explain to the audience what is anxiety in its simplest terms?
I think the most simple way to think about anxiety is it's something that you're afraid of or in anticipation of, something that's fearful. And anxiety has a lot of the same symptoms that a fear reaction would have to something.
Okay, how is anxiety and stress related?
Well,
or are they really?
Well, in many ways they are. Stress is a natural response to something that you are worried about and anticipating, whereas anxiety is an extreme version of stress that's kind of lost control.
I think we want to think about stress in terms of that's something that we're all experiencing, and in fact anxiety is something that we're all experiencing. And sometimes when you're under a lot of stress, you may not be actually experiencing anxiety, but when you have a lot of stress in your life, it may predispose you, if you have a tendency towards being an anxious person, to be more prone to become anxious. All of us are going to have anxiety, and so we don't want, that is something that actually is a benefit to us. It's a natural response biologically that we have for survival. It makes us pay attention, be more careful. So we want to understand what anxiety is. It becomes a problem when we can't function due to anxiety. So that's something that I'm sure we'll touch on as we go through the show.
Yeah.
So are there different types of anxiety that adults, even children, experience that you are familiar with?
Yes. Anxiety in general is a cluster of different disorders, from social anxiety, and in turn we see social anxiety where they have a fear of humiliation or embarrassment in a social situation, like if they go to a birthday party, they're fearful that they may be unwelcomed, or they may do something that other people may laugh at them. There's separation anxiety, where a child is afraid to separate from their parent and therefore may not want to go to school. So those are two such examples of the different types of anxiety.
And then some people have just generalized anxiety. I mean, there are a lot of adolescents who we sometimes think there's a specific event that is always causing the anxiety. And generally there's something perhaps in their past experience, but sometimes the anxiety is just a generalized anxiety. They're anxious about everything. So it's really important to distinguish that. And developmentally, some young children may be anxious about going to a birthday party because they've never been. But once they've gone and experienced it with some reassurance, they're fine at birthday parties. It's a problem when, after they've been to birthday parties, which are a positive event, that they're still having a lot of difficulty. Or same with school. We expect kindergartners to cry when their parents leave them. Sometimes we're crying when we leave them. But so it's important to keep that in mind, that developmentally there are stages that children are going through. So you have to look at the context.
Right. And obsessive compulsive disorder, is that a form of anxiety as well?
Anxiety is a big part of OCD. So you're going to, when a person has a compulsion to do something, so if they're checking, like we all check, right? So it's a problem. You have OCD when your checking gets to the point where you can't function. So when you check something or you're prevented from checking something, like you turn the lights off and all of that stuff, an OCD person will get this real buildup of anxiety, and the only way to release it is to go and check. So that's why there's a lot of checking, or the hand washing, because there's this tension and anxiety that builds, kind of like, some people explained it to me like a sneeze. It's hard to stop a sneeze. Like you can kind of, hold it in for a while, but eventually you really need to sneeze. And so, so OCD, I think people who are really, again, these are brain-based kinds of difficulties, that compulsion, when they're prevented from doing that, then there's a lot of anxiety. So they're very related.
Now, do you see that in the schools? obsessive compulsive disorder? Do you see
Yes.
that in the school?
Yeah, we have students at my high school that have aspects of that. A lot of teenagers like to self-diagnose, so do we adults.
Right.
But we do see some children, and they may need some special accommodations as a result. They may not have any specialized instruction or anything like that, but they may need like an opportunity to go someplace quiet, to get back together, to get it back together. So you do see that. It's not a very common disorder that I see in terms of an anxiety disorder. I think there are far more common things that we see related to anxiety in the school setting.
With academic performance.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about just general anxiety, not so specific with compulsive disorder, because that has its own, it looks a little bit different.
Yes.
So you both have expertise in this area, but your settings, you work in various different levels. I know that some work in elementary, middle, and high school. So addressing both of you, because your expertise is, because you work with that, can you tell me what those symptoms you're finding are most common and what it looks like in elementary and middle, and then for you in high school?
Sure, I'll start with
Sure.
the younger age. In elementary school and middle school, the presentation of anxiety would be school avoidance, where kids just don't show up to school and they attribute their fear or their worry to something in the school building. Real or unreal, that's their fear, and that the idea of coming to school is anxiety provoking to the point where they will absolutely refuse to come to school, or if they do, they fall apart, and consequently requiring the support of the guidance counselors or the school psychologists. We see a lot of anxiety in terms of work neatness. Kids will have their worksheet and it must be done with a specific type of handwriting. If there's a tear in the paper or a smudge, they become really upset about that uncontrollably. That might be another presentation. Another presentation is that they react to negative feedback. So if a teacher says, can you redo that line, or what are you trying to tell me in this sentence? And they react really intensely. Now it's different. Most kids don't like negative feedback. They like that positive feedback. But when you receive negative feedback and you react it really intensely, that's a problem. Not just once, but if that's a pattern of your behavior over time.
Right.
Because then it impacts you by changing the relationship you and your teacher or staff member would have. Because that means you can't tolerate or handle feedback. And part of being in school is to receive feedback.
Right. Right.
I think that brings up an important point about perfectionism.
Right.
That people who tend to have unrealistic ideas, children and young adults, teenagers, young adults, and even adults who have perfectionistic tendencies and aspirations, lots of times you're rewarded for that because you're a hard worker. You're going to do it perfect. You're going to do it right. But the ideal of perfectionism to the point where you're becoming extremely anxious, or somebody gives you correction or something to do differently, that can become overwhelming. And so there are things that predispose people to having anxiety, and then there are things that will then maybe, in addition to that, maybe add on to that, that could cause it to become a real problem where you'd have to seek out some help. So at the high school level, we see similar things. School avoidance is probably one of the number one problems with kind of addressing anxiety, because I can provide assistance to students who are having anxiety symptoms in the school, teach them some strategies, make some accommodations, and get them acclimated, desensitize them to some of the things that are making them anxious by giving them support. But if they never come in our doors, then I can't do any of those things. So that is really difficult for the school team to really, and really parents are our partners. We really have to have our parents on board, not just at the elementary level. And many times parents are more on board at the elementary level because that's the age where parents are usually more involved. And they're more active in the school. So, but that is such an important piece that we have to have the parents also feeling confident that their child who is anxious is going to be cared for and dealt with in a positive way and supported.
Yeah, what are some of the symptoms that the children can experience through anxiety, like some physical symptoms, for example?
Oh, that's a good question.
Well, let's look at it from the different levels of school. In elementary, we see a lot of crying,
Okay.
a lot of shutting down, a lot of resistance to do basic things like go outside to play at recess or to complete a worksheet. A lot of psychosomatic symptoms, and a big word for meaning: tummy aches, headaches, nausea, dizziness.
Gotcha.
Even things like difficulty concentrating. In the middle school, we may see a lot of refusals where they refuse to do something. So they shut down just like an elementary student, but their shutdown is a little bit more emphatic, meaning they're a lot more determined not to comply and not to follow through with a task or an expectation. Other ways we see anxiety manifest or express itself in the younger student body is students will find that they will complain a lot about things that are not really applicable. So they may say that their teacher doesn't like them, or they have no friends, or they're afraid of things that aren't necessarily an accurate account of a situation. And it's important that we address these issues with kids that are anxious in the schools.
Yeah, I think the same physiological symptoms that young children experience, I think are experienced throughout. So tummy aches and stomach problems, gastrointestinal problems. Sometimes there are legitimate things that are physically happening. Your heart races when you're anxious. So when you're having an anxiety, kids will talk about having an anxiety attack. We've all heard the term panic attack. So those things are when the anxiety has gotten to such a fever pitch that you're having a lot of physical symptoms, and those are very real. If I hooked you up to a blood pressure monitor, I would see that your blood pressure has elevated. I would see that your heart rate has increased. And in fact, sometimes some of the biomedical feedback that we use with we don't do that at the school level, obviously, but there are programs when you work with counselors outside that really help you learn how to do certain techniques to feel what you're feeling and bring your heart rate down, and bring some of those physiological symptoms under control, giving you a sense of mastery that I can manage this. This is something that I can
manage. So the key really is to validate that these feelings are really real to them.
Yes.
And to help them through counselors at the school and the psychologists, and work as a team with the parents to take it to the next step, that at the school we can work through this with the child. And we will be back right after this message.
Hi, I'm Jody Rissi, the host for Food for Thought and the supervisor of Food and Nutrition Services. I come to you today with exciting news about summer meals in Anne Arundel County Public Schools. Summer is coming soon. You may be thinking about what your child will do for healthy meals while school is out. The good news is that the United States Department of Agriculture is collaborating with Anne Arundel County Public Schools to serve free meals. It's food that's in while school is out. This summer, Anne Arundel County Public Schools continues to focus on healthy students, healthy schools, cultivating communities of wellness. Summer months are critical when we have hungry children. So act now to ensure that our most vulnerable children are fed during the summer, so they too can grow up nutritionally healthy, academically strong, and best able to fulfill their dreams. To learn more about school meals and nutrition or a program in your school, just call me at 410-222-5900. Keep watching AACPS TV and watch the next segment of Food for Thought.
Welcome back to At Your Service. We are having the discussion around the topic of student anxiety. So, when a student is experiencing anxiety, when should parents start to be concerned whether it's blooming into an anxiety disorder?
Good question. Like we mentioned earlier, anxiousness is a normal and natural reaction to stress.
Correct.
The challenge for parents is to learn or be able to identify when their child is under so much distress that it's impacting their lifestyle. So if your child does not want to come to school
Mm-hmm.
over a number of days, or constantly complains about tummy aches or headaches that have been medically checked out and ruled out to not have any physiological impact, or if your child complains a lot about feeling isolated or rejected or worries a lot. I think parents are the best judge for their kids, and they should take these things seriously, these comments, especially if it happens continuously. I think that would be the best measure.
I agree with that, and I think that often parents will do very common sense and very reasonable things to try to support their child, and when those things are not helping their son or daughter, then they know that something's not right. And so as parents, we talk with other parents, we see our children with other children. So I think if in our gut something's not right and our child is truly unhappy, being very stressed when the events are not really truly stressful, so they're seeing a lot of stress and upsettedness when the context doesn't really deserve that kind of response, then I think then you start asking questions, and you talk to your child's teacher, and then you may talk to other individuals in the school that can assist you. Maybe they may observe your child in the classroom.
Right.
They may have a conference with you and your child, or just with you, depending on the age of the child. So I think those things are something that you really bring to the school and find out who in the school, and they're usually student service personnel like myself and Duane, Dr. Isava, and there's pupil personnel workers. Sometimes a pupil personnel worker is involved because the child's missed a lot of school, and so that's where we uncover things. But be proactive as a parent. Don't be afraid to call in. We have guidance counselors in the student services staff that can help. Sometimes the school nurse is involved because the kid's always there with a tummy ache and wants to go home early. That's a red flag. Are you picking your child up every other day because they want to go home for some reason? So all of those things, it's important to start then. Catching it early is so important. If you can catch it at the elementary level and really address and give the child the skills that they need to feel confident, you are just doing so much. We as school personnel want to help you, because when you get to the high school and when you're at the high school level, your child is too big to pick up and put in the car. So we, as a high school person, many times I have students who have been school avoidant and dealing with true anxiety for a long time. And then those behaviors, there are a lot of secondary things that start happening.
What are some parenting techniques that they can do at home to help alleviate some of the anxiety? Like if maybe some morning things or some evening strategies as parents?
Well, one, sleep is so important. If you don't have enough sleep, you are predisposing yourself already to anxiety and panic. It's just physiologically, your threshold is lowered, and so a littler thing is going to send you over the edge. We've all experienced that. So, so that's really important. But the other thing I think that as parents that we can do is not be anxious ourselves over our child's anxiety. And anxiety, we haven't talked about this, but it runs in families. So I tend to be a little bit of an anxious person myself, and my daughter has anxiety a little bit even more than me. So that's something that I know I have to worry when I have to not show my worry when she's anxious. I'm worried about, I have a lot of parents who become anxious over their, I don't know if you've seen that, over their children's anxiety. So that is really important for the parent.
I think there are some specific recommendations we can make, having seen what anxiety looks like in a school and how it impacts kids' or students' ability to obtain their education. One is avoid being too talkative to their children. Our natural inclination as parents is to rush in and rescue with words a circumstance that may not necessarily be real. Some of the anxiety may not be real, or because really when you look at anxiety, it's an overreaction to a stressful situation, or the perception of a stressful situation that then you then react too much to. If you have that belief or that approach, then you want to slow down and let your child do more of the talking. by asking engaging questions. Can you tell me why your tummy might be hurting? Do you understand why it's important to go to school? What's stopping you from going to school? How can I help you go to school? What can we do together so that when you do go to school you feel comfortable or you feel safe? So really the key is engaging in your child rather than trying to be overly reassuring or being too worrisome, and then not talking too much but allowing your child to talk more so that they can kind of figure out why these feelings and thoughts are consuming them, these anxious feelings and thoughts are consuming them.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
What about, you know, many times I'll have parents when I am working with a student who has some anxiety issues, you know, they just need to get over it. You know, there's really nothing going on. They just need to move on.
I think sometimes people, particularly with teenagers, don't believe or sometimes think teenagers are being manipulative and trying to avoid something else. And I'm not saying that that never happens. It sometimes does happen, but it can happen along with true anxiety. And so you really do have to be very aware that that is a possibility, that there may be some things that the anxious student is also really wants to be home to engage in being online or doing some fun things, right? But there really truly still is an anxiety about school. It does not mean that the secondary gain that I get by being at home isn't real. But there are things and strategies that we can really offer to parents when we're working with them and they're consulting with us.
Yeah, I know that when, because I'm a pupil personnel worker, I know when I was at the high school level, I would always talk with parents and we would say, you know, you need to sometimes make home not as wonderful as going to school. So that was a part of the piece of the puzzle, and they have technology, they have computers, they have all those kind of things. So do you see that sometimes that anxiety might be part of the piece, but do you see manipulation as being anything of that? I mean, sometimes parents may be like, is it anxiety, is it manipulation? They seem torn, so
it's overwhelming for a parent, too, to have a child who's anxious and who's not doing what they need to do. So the child they also have to get to work. They're anxious about not parents have a lot to do. And so this is not something that they're accustomed to. So sometimes the path of least resistance is to let the child stay home that day. That can then bloom. And I want us to be careful. We're not blaming parents because they really also need support in this. They have other children that are going to school just fine.
They have
and then what's wrong with John? He won't go to school. I never had this before. Something must really be wrong. So then a lot of absenteeism occurs, which when you avoid the thing you're afraid of, the fear usually grows.
Exactly.
And so exposure and with support, as Dr. Isava was saying, is really important. We need to provide that support, but we also need to provide that exposure. So we have to understand what those manipulations might be. We all do it, so we don't have to judge it, but we have to be aware of that. But the anxiety is real, and we do have to address that and give children skills to deal with that.
I think parents have to be aware that yes, teenagers and young kids may develop these patterns of behavior that may seem manipulative, and that's a reasonable insight. But if your kid is truly anxious, that came before the manipulation. And the reason is because I'm anxious and being manipulative or being resistant or defiant is one of my coping skills or avoidance skills to avoid or manage the anxiety.
I see, yeah.
And I think it's important that, yes, there are consequences for behaviors that are inappropriate, but if those behaviors that are inappropriate are stemming from an anxiety disorder, then we're not really getting to the root of the matter. And we're missing our mark in how we may be of assistance to these students. So taking a closer examination of why these kids manipulate or why these kids avoid school or resistant to support is going to be key.
And it's interesting that we've talked about this, because sometimes we're looking at the symptoms, the behaviors that they're exhibiting, but it's really a mental health, emotional disorder.
Right.
So it stems from an emotional disorder, and many times, because we're a school setting, we're just looking at those resulting behaviors. And so if we put a behavior intervention, it's not necessarily going to work, because it's like putting a Band-Aid, even though the wound is still bleeding. So one of the things I'm going to move to, because we only have a few more minutes, is if a parent is watching and is concerned about their child, what do you suggest that they do?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, as we had mentioned before, the partnership between the school and the home is an integral part of the support, because the parents, the students may be experiencing anxiety in different capacities at home and school.
Correct.
Oftentimes we may hear that at school they're great, but at home they have a lot of difficulty,
Right.
or vice versa. But on closer examination, we realize that's not as accurate as it may be perceived. I think that partnership and collaboration with a pediatrician, an outside provider, if there's one, the teachers, and kind of coming together and looking at the information about that kid's behavior and emotions is going to be integral.
Yeah, and I think that when we are working with young children, we're going to approach it differently.
Correct.
We're working with older children. There are times when the school is not going to be able to do as much, and we do need to work with outside providers, and parents aren't sure, how do I go about accessing that? And they can talk with their school psychologist, their school guidance counselor, if there may be a school social worker, there may be a PPW in the building. So there are many people that they can talk to that can help them navigate that system, give them some suggestions about how to go about navigating the mental health system, to get some further assistance to deal with and untangle sometimes a difficulty that they're not really sure. There may be other family factors and circumstances, and we haven't touched on some of those things that may have been traumatic. And so, or death or loss can sometimes, of a parent or a significant family member, can also produce some of these things. So I think it's important to talk with your school people, and every situation is going to be very different. We can give you some general ideas here about anxiety, what it looks like, and some things to be aware of and to be cautious about. But talk with the professionals in your school, and if they feel you need further assistance and they can't support your child as fully as your child might need to be supported, because there's home things that need to be addressed, and then we're going to suggest that, and we're going to support you as you try to navigate that system as well.
Are there any resources, like if there's a parent watching, is there any kind of place they could go online, any probable books or anything that you could quickly suggest for them as a starting point to get more knowledge about anxiety disorders?
I think if you Google anxiety disorders in children, you will come up with a lot of different materials. And I don't have any specific titles to recommend right now. But I do suggest, again, going back to talking with the people in the school, and maybe looking at some of these materials. Sometimes you can go to Amazon and check out some of the inside of the titles to see if it applies to you. But and there's also the Anne Arundel County Public Schools website, and we do have a psych services website, and there are some materials that may be available to parents there, and there's also a way to find out the names of some of the people who might be serving you in your school, and phone numbers and things of that nature.
And every school in our school system has a school psychologist, has access to one, has access to school counselors and health services. So there's lots of resources for our parents out there. And we just thank you so much for coming on our show. It's been a wealth of information.
We appreciate it.
And thank you very much for joining us today.